Very few software packages include the consequences of this shaking for damage and loss, and that's what we call in this business risk. In the rest of the world, hazard and risk are kind of the same word. For us, they mean something totally different. It's the consequences of the shaking. And outside of the insurance industry, there's very few tools that can handle the complex interactions that lead to damage and loss. And that's where Vitor Silva, who's led our risk group for a year and a half and been a part of GEM for 6 years, is leading the way and opening doors for the ability of people to take these kind of hazard models and turn them into terms that people can really deal with. So I'm pleased to bring Vitor out.
I would like just to start by echoing the words of my colleagues, even though that I'm the one presenting. This is actually the work of hundreds of people, hundreds of international experts. I would like also to acknowledge Dr. Helen Crowley, because she was the one coordinating the risk activities in the first years of GEM. So just to give a little bit of context, so Mark already talked about this component, the seismic hazard within GEM. I will be talking about the exposure, physical vulnerability, and how we are combining these three components into risk. And then Chris will continue explaining how this results from the physical vulnerability, just the direct losses can be used in the integrated risk, taking into account the social vulnerability. So let's try to take this from a very practical point of view. If I want to start my risk model today, how can I use these data sets to start with vulnerability? How am I going to develop these curves that are establishing the damage and ground shaking, my probability of loss, and the ground motion that I will have due to an earthquake? So, first of all, we have to take a look at all the work that has been done for decades and decades. And one of the global components of GEM was in charge of collecting a lot of these existing models. And in addition, here at the Secretariat, we also collected a lot of functions. Currently, we have more than 1,000 functions in our database. And today, if you check the platform, we have already more than 300 functions uploaded. Once you go there, you can actually click in some of these functions. You will have access to information that might be very useful for you to take a decision if you should use this model or not, like what is your intensity measure type, methodologies, and so on. However, it's quite likely that you will not find curves for your region, or perhaps you will find for some types of construction, but not all of them. And knowing that we need sometimes to develop new models, this global component also developed a lot of guidelines, which are currently in review and we expect to release at the end of this year. And these guidelines has a lot of methodologies, can use analytical methods, empirical methods, use information from past earthquakes. But soon, through our training sessions and workshops, we noticed that just providing these guidelines is not enough. If some experts or engineers are seeing these guidelines, these methodologies for the first time, we also need tools to support, to implement this methodology. And as a response to that, GEM has also been developing what we call a risk models toolkit, which has many modules, and one of them is on vulnerability. This is basically a suite of tools that implements these methodologies that the global component has been proposing. Just to give you a very brief example, within the South America regional program, we are developing about 40 fragility functions and vulnerability functions in collaboration with the local experts. And using these tools, we will be able to develop structure-specific functions for all the construction typologies that we found in South America. And we are starting the same exercise in Sub-Saharan Africa in March this year. In addition, we also acknowledge that developing these models is only the first stage. We also need to try to calibrate these models, to validate these models, to understand if these results are actually reasonable for this region. And for that, GEM also had another global component, which is the Global Consequences Database. It has information for more than 70 earthquakes, not just about damage, but also about fatalities, critical infrastructures, and also the social impact. And using these results, one will be able to compare the losses from these models and also from past earthquakes. For instance, here showing an example of the Christchurch earthquake. Now moving to exposure. And by exposure, I mean a data set capable of giving me the spatial distribution of my elements exposed to the hazard, and also the vulnerability characteristics of these elements. We created first a taxonomy, a global component that created this common language across all the global components to make sure that we could communicate in the same terms. This taxonomy is, for instance, on a glossary online, but in addition, we also developed tools to classify the buildings and produce these codes that basically is the DNA of each building. And using this strings, this taxonomy, we have also already started collaborating with one of our associate partners, with the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, and this is going to be incorporated in the World Housing Encyclopedia reports. Now moving to another global component, the Global Exposure Database, which is another product of GEM. We have 4 levels of exposure information. We have full coverage for level 0, so country-based exposure. It's a type of information that is not as detailed. And then we also have level 1, 2, and 3 with different levels of coverage and also of detail. Finally, we also aim to try to improve this exposure databases and data sets with the outcomes from the regional programs. Here I'm just showing an example of the exposure model that has been developed for the Andean countries within the South America project. And for each of the country, we were able to estimate number of dwellings, number of buildings, but also the fraction of all of these buildings in the different construction types. And at last, let's say that unfortunately I cannot find anything in the global database. There's not a regional program, but I still want to build my exposure model. GEM also developed 4 tools in collaboration with ImageCat and other partners in the inventory data capture tool. There will actually be a booth about these tools here today, and John Bevington is here also to present this at first hand. But these tools allow users to go into the field with their smartphones, tablets, or cell phones and collect information directly next to the buildings, but it's also possible to use remote sensing information, satellite imagery, to collect information about the buildings and finally create these exposure models. This is it in terms of data sets and these tools that were produced with the regional partnerships and also the global components. And now I would like to present what can I calculate today? What type of losses, what type of damage, what type of analysis can I do with the risk component of OpenQuake? I would like to do this showing you, using an example, the district of Lisbon. It's where more or less 2 million people live, very close to active faults. And very soon we understood that the risk component of OpenQuake would have to fit the needs of very end users, from the financial sector, insurance, reinsurance, also disaster risk management, also the academia research. So what you see here, it's the type of information that can be processed now by the risk component of OpenQuake. So we can provide number of buildings, perhaps just the area of the buildings, the economic value, taking into account different types of costs, such as the structure, but perhaps in hospitals or other critical facilities, it's more important to consider the non-structural components and contents, and maybe for the commercial activity, business interruption. OpenQuake can also calculate injuries and fatalities and homeless, and for that we can also consider occupants at the different times of the day. Also retrofitting, because OpenQuake can also do benefit cost analysis, and finally limits and deductibles in order to calculate insured losses. So if consideration is given to a single earthquake, let's just focus on a single earthquake. We can produce, as Marco presented, many ground motion fields, many realizations for a single earthquake, and then the asset component communicates to the risk component to calculate, let's say, economic losses for the structural and non-structural components at the various locations at my exposure model. However, I may want to understand the damage, how many buildings collapse, how many buildings had extensive damage and are in need of repair, and OpenQuake can also calculate the mean and the standard deviation of these values. And in addition, it can do a disaggregation for construction type. This will allow me to understand what are the building typologies that are contributing to the human losses and economic losses, and hence where maybe retrofitting interventions should be focused. This is the results we have for single earthquakes, in addition, of course, to casualties. But what if instead I want to consider probabilistic risk? I want to consider all the possible earthquakes that might happen within a given time span and for a given region. Well, For once, we can take all the hazard curves from the hazard component of the OpenQuake. We can use our vulnerability functions, and we can calculate these loss exceedance curves. These curves that relate different levels of losses with what is my probability of exceeding these losses. And since we propagate all the uncertainties coming from the hazard, if we have 10 paths on the logic tree, we will have 10 hazard curves, and consequently 10 loss curves as well on the risk. Then we can look at these curves in different returns periods, and we can produce risk maps, which basically for each location tells me the expected losses for different probabilities of exceedance within a given time span. Moving now to a different type of calculations. So instead of using hazard curves, I might be interested in using stochastic event sets. And in this case, I might want to produce maybe 10,000, 20,000 years representative of seismicity in my region. And for that, I can produce PMLs, which establish the relation between different levels of losses and return periods of exceedance. And this can be done for my whole portfolio, all the collection of buildings in my region of interest, or I might be focused in a given regions within my country or within my region in this case, and OpenQuake can also extract information for these specific locations. Finally, the last calculator we have, it's a benefit-cost ratio calculator. It's a calculator that will allow, that will provide information to decision makers about if from economic point of view, is it worth to apply a retrofitting technique or go to a more robust seismic design of the building. For instance, in this particular case for Turkey, for Istanbul, a value above 1 indicates that it should be applied to a retrofitting technique. Below 1 says that at least from economic point of view, it's not advantageous. Going now to how are we disseminating these tools, how is the world using the data sets, the models, and so on, and how we are trying to provide training. This is, for instance, a training that we did in Colombia last year, and I can tell you that in the next months we will have another one in Peru, again with about 7 countries, and we're also trying to do another workshop with our partners in Turkey at Query with 7 countries in the Middle East. And we also have another trainings in Kathmandu, for instance, in Potsdam, and in Pavia, last year we also had a training which had about representatives from 14 countries, and this was 3 days in which we had the opportunity to test the tools, understand if the data sets that JAM is providing is actually reasonable, is actually in agreement with what exists in the country, and many users also had the chance to use and test the OpenQuake engine and provide us feedback. Just to show you some cases of how our partners, other people in the world using this. This is one of the applications in which the Android tool, the IDCT tool, was used to build an exposure model for Kathmandu, a collaboration between a university in the United Kingdom and NSET. And we will have also a presentation about this afternoon. And an exposure model was built. This allows us also to build a shelter model, and now this calculation, these results are used to calculate risk in Kathmandu. Another example, the IDCT tool was also tested to collect damage after the Iquique earthquake last year. The Global Vulnerability Database has been used to collect functions for an ongoing program in Guatemala to evaluate the schools that were affected by the earthquakes in 2012 and 2014. Again, schools, the assessment of a number of schools in Switzerland, in Basel, that it's being done by a company. The probabilistic risk assessment that we already show in other occasions. In this particular case, we use classical SHA, but we also use event-based. And now we are in a calibration process with our private partners to further test the OpenQuake engine. And finally, some results actually by one of our private sponsors in OpenRe, in which economic losses were calculated for Ecuador and Germany. Just to end the presentation, what's next? This is just a couple of points. I'm sure there will be more, but we would like to continue improving the test coverage of OpenQuake, the efficiency, the user-friendliness, and also try to assess lifelines, which is something we're currently doing already, and also critical facilities. In terms of the risk models toolkit, we would like to implement additional methodologies, probably with a higher reliability in accuracy and for the needs of the engineering sector. Improve also data sets and some of the models, so collect more vulnerability and fragility functions. And we hope that now it will be the own authors going to the platform and uploading their own functions. And finally, in terms of regional initiatives, we hope to have a bigger coverage to finish the regional program we have in South America and that is starting now in Sub-Saharan Africa, and have also a bigger coverage in other parts of the world. Thank you very much.